with the first speaker. JP Ascher is going to tell us something about red and blue pencils.
Thank you. It's good to see you all, and thank you for coming. I come from a tradition where you provide accessibility copies. So if you need a written copy of the talk, note the word need. There are 4 right there by Michael Barani. And if you want a written copy or would benefit from it, you can also have one. Just wait a little bit to make sure anyone who might need one takes one first and then casually go up. And if you are a playful person who wants a copy, there's a set of 4 colored sticks there, which I would invite you to annotate the accessibility copy which you need or want with that during the talk, and it'll become much clearer. So wait a beat, and then go get a copy if you want one. So I want to thank the organizers of this particular program and the INI more generally for letting me speak. It's a real pleasure to get to share some work in progress, particularly because I think it has interesting connections to the development of structure in mathematics. This work is funded by a UKRI grant studying the global history of mathematics, won and supervised by Dr. Michael Barani, and who you'll see speak later here today too. And it's a pleasure to get to collaborate with both him and my other colleague, as we all have very different methods we bring to bear on some of the same objects. In this talk, I'll be drawing on paperwork history and the traditional Virginia School of Bibliography that sees the evidence present in books and archives as a form of primary evidence for history. This relates to some similar work I've been doing with early modern abstracting and mathematical bibliography, but that's for another talk. Similarly, the earlier drafts of this talk dealt a lot more with Rockefeller in Inderjeet Parmar's thought about using capital to build alliances between global elites. Indeed, this is the engine driving what I'm about to talk to you about, but there turned out to be enough material in the bibliographical and forensic analysis, so that will wait for Q&A or another talk. Now is a good time if you want a copy to take one, having waited for anyone who might need a copy. So let's begin with a letter dated 29 October 1963. Arthur J. Lowwater, the executive editor of the Mathematical Reviews, writes to John V. Weyhausen, who's on the editorial committee for the American Mathematical Society, which sponsors the Mathematical Reviews. Both have somewhat senior roles at this point, so a letter here marks a significant administrative action. In this letter, Lowwater recounts a rather distressing state of affairs concerning office supplies. Apparently, the office manager, Ray Gutscher, specified certain materials for the Mathematical Reviews, but the supplier refused to provide them. He would like the MS to intercede. For something seemingly minor, the description is extensive. We have, of course, been willing to take stock items for those things which suit our needs. Mr. Gutscher, our office manager, has taken extra pains to determine the exact specifications of certain specialized items which are needed for MR, the math reviews. He was, however, told by 2 personal acquaintances of his in the local supply houses that they had been notified by the MS that they were no longer to discuss any aspect of specifications, even to the extent of supplying model numbers, sizes, samples, etc., with anyone connected to the Mathematical Reviews. Note, it is kind of funny, that in the letter, Lowwater alludes to both substitutions and essential items. I want you to hold on to this, substitution and essential item, but does not say what those items are. It's all kind of very vague. The letter is quite long and between several important officers, but kind of leaves out specific details. On 7 November, about a week later, Albert E. Medar, Jr., the treasurer for the MS, writes Weyhausen back, sending a carbon copy to Joseph L. Dube, who had been on the Mathematical Reviews editorial committee, but was at this point the president of the AMS, J.W. Green, the associate secretary of the AMS, and W.H. Hosmer, who I'm not actually sure about, and if anyone knows who that is, I'd love to know. But he might be the supply manager for the AMS or a procuring agent. This letter seems to be an escalation, so we should take its bureaucratic language cautiously. Medar writes defensively that Ray Gutscher ought to accept substitutions that fit his specifications rather than asking for specifications provided by suppliers. Like Jack, a nickname for Lowwater, I cannot imagine that any purchasing office would not welcome precise requisitions. However, there is a serious question as to how precise requisitions are obtained. When they are obtained by consultation with the supplier, embarrassment results if the purchase order does not go to that particular supplier. It seems to him that Mr. Gucher has been told not to seek specifications from suppliers, but to formulate his own specifications. What precisely is happening here? And why is it so apparently important? I think there were several difficulties with supplies, but one difficulty regarded a particular colored pencil. Here we have 3 invoices working through getting red pencils, and you can see the sort of supply trouble that Mathematical Review's office was experiencing. First, on 22 June 1963, Ray Gucher ordered 6 dozen red pencils and received black. My friend pointed out he probably got red painted pencils that were black, which actually makes sense rather than some sort of hostility. Rather humorously, I'd like to imagine that is written in black pencils right there, received black. I don't know. Then on 24 July 1963, Ray Gucher ordered 10 dozen red pencils, specifying not artistic, and he didn't get them. This item is checked, if you look on the left, so presumably part of the issue. Finally, on 29 August 1963, Ray Gucher specified specific pencils to be delivered immediately. Ebhard Faber medium, number 2126. You'll note that he records this delivery in both places, showing that it took him 2 tries to get these things. So he had to order red pencils in larger and larger amounts 3 times. Why did he ultimately specify this brand and model, which seems to be the issue here? While the Color Bright trademark had been owned and used by Ebhard Faber since the 19th century-ish sometime, generally for rubber bands and other office supplies, their red-colored office pencil was advertised as new on 23 October 1950 in Newsweek. By 1963, it had been repeatedly advertised in American magazines as an alternative to pencils that wrote poorly. The ad copy reads, "Brilliant colors reduce eye strain. Feather-light writing produces intense lines. Non-crumbling leads eliminate waste at sharpener. Points guaranteed against breakage means fewer work interruptions," etc., etc. The writing is wet-proof, smear-proof, and fade-proof. Now, if you took me up on grabbing one of those little sticks, you could try rubbing it right now, or lick your thumb and rub it, which might be interesting to note. This, of course, is an improvement over artistic pencils, which would smear, and an improvement on older styles of correcting pencils that might also be called magic ink pens, where you had to dip the writing material in water to use it. You see, by this point, the Mathematical Reviews had adopted a ring editor style process throughout the organization. They acquired mathematical materials from around the world at varying rates. Their editors had varying mathematical and language expertise, and their reviewers too. Individual articles passed through several hands on their way to the completed article. Here's a copy of a proof sheet where we can see the typical use of colored pencils in correction. The first corrector used red, the second used blue, and the final corrector used green. It's interesting to note that this pattern is still used in accounting and auditing firms today, and I actually haven't been able to trace a good source for it. I'd be curious if anyone here had an idea. When colored pencils actually first began to appear as office supplies, they appear in these 3 colors, red, blue, and green. And even Pacchioli's 14th century treatise on accounting mentions ways for doing multiple checks, but not with colored pencils. So it's possible here there's no obvious documented evidence for the source of this multicolored ring editing practice. But this example helps show why acquiring colored pencils was particularly urgent for Gucher. They are an irreplaceable part of the editorial process. Because of the dispersed heteroglossy of mathematics and the languages involved, different contributions to the math reviews, the MR, need to be distinguished in a paper workflow. Similar processes to the multicolor ring editing were used on memos and plans too, which really only makes natural sense for an office culture used to using ring editing models with colored pencils. This is just one of the many complicated workflow diagrams up on the screen, produced by the Mathematical Reviews around the same era that Gucher was buying these pencils, which shows the different paths that a document can take on the way to proof, that thing you were just looking at. The process would need an easy way to distinguish different contributions and different adjustments. The process also needed a way to show where a document was in the process. The workflows, of course, got more and more complicated over the time. On top, you can see one picture of the workflow that unrolls on the floor to about 6 feet long. And the math reviews retained the role of colored pencils in marking up copy. In the lower left, you can see the original 3 colors of pencil in the modern office across the top, now supplemented with orange, brown, and purple too. Pencils also became part of the instructions for authors, who would underline German in green, Greek in red, and use other such marks to help readers in those composing the typed print, which you can see on the right. Otto Neugebauer seemed to use color to signal different kinds of information while editing the Zentralblatt for Mathematik, though I don't have any evidence of their use as ring editing. These 4 slip cards show published reviews in the Zentralblatt, where Neugebauer has noted the topic in red pencil and corrected the name in blue. I think these were used to produce the volume indexes. He made an index for each color. The red marks became the first pass at the classification of mathematical concepts, something worth thinking about for this group in particular, because you know he's just taking it from the title itself, unless he has to rewrite it, which there's a kind of line where the title's pretty good, unless it's not. These cards were among the things he brought with him to the United States when he founded the Mathematical Reviews with support from the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1940s. So it's tempting to draw a line between Neugebauer and pencil use at the MR in a similar way that there is a line between the largest early 20th century pencil manufacturer, A.W. Faber in Germany, and Ebhard Faber in the United States. Ebhard Faber initially worked in his family's business in the United States and only broke away later. Yet it isn't quite that simple. As early as the 16th century, the Borrowdale mines in Cumberland, England, were known for their black lead, which we now know as graphite. Conrad Gessner writes about its superiority to other leads for writing. In the 17th century. And later on, or no, sorry, that's in the 16th century. In the 17th century, the streets of London were in fact full of black lead merchants supplying the world. You could just buy some black lead and wrap some paper around it and write with it. This graphite was, however, known only in the Borrowdale mine. So when the mine was closed in 1678 to prevent overmining, reopened in 1710 but with stricter controls, the world of pencil users sought alternatives. To address the limited supply, German pencil manufacturers began combining lower quality graphite with sulfur in the 18th century, among them Caspar Faber, who established the Faber pencil-making family. This produced pencils of varying hardness, which we still have in the same form. HB, 2, 3 are all his invention. But these early polygrade pencils were still quite brittle. In the 1790s, the English war with the French blocked all graphite exports, so Lazare Carnot sought a substitute method to produce pencils in France. Nicolas Jacques Conté, supposedly within a few days, developed the process now named after him, the Conté process, which grinds impure graphite into powder to refine it, and then combines it with clay to make it solid again. This is the process now used by pencil makers. By the mid-19th century, this Conté process was known throughout Europe, and around 1840, Elias Wolff imported the technique to England and produced the first creta levis, that is Latin for smooth chalk. Pencils made by this Conté process with non-graphite pigment, so colored, smooth chalk, which is how he thought of this thing. These are among the first colored pencils for office work. It's hard to answer like the first, and it doesn't really matter, right? 1840, these are among the first. Maybe there's another one. I'd love to know if you know of another. Eberhard Faber opened a stationery store in 1848 in the US and began exporting red cedar to A.W. Faber in 1852 for pencils. But by 1861, he'd established his own factory. So, by the time of this 1897 catalog that you see up here, from A.W. Faber, he'd been selling hundreds of kinds of pencils. The pencil had become a global commodity. Aesthetically mimicking English Borrowdale graphite using a French process, A.W. Faber had purchased exclusive rights to a graphite mine in Siberia, near the Chinese border, where the firm employed Chinese miners. Cased in North American red cedar, these Siberian lead pencils established the Faber family as global pencil suppliers. You can see them over there on the left. Siberian lead pencils. The red pencil and blue, and green also advertised here on your right, thus participated in a complicated global manufacturing infrastructure. They were a born local technology first and developed into a simulacrum born global technology. I think the word supply is a useful term here to think about global intellectual projects like these. Young mathematicians might supply the proof that is needed for some part of the classification of finite simple groups. Or a school might supply teachers with knowledge, or a bookseller may supply reprints to readers and waste paper to binders. But supply has two contradictory senses. It can mean to provision. that is to fill up, suppleo in Latin, or to substitute. For example, Goldsmith in his travels writes, "Yet still the loss of wealth is here supplied by arts," meaning arts have substituted for wealth. Grants can supply missing but deserved funding, and the supply chain mimics this pattern. Think of these pencils in terms of supply. One red pencil is substituted for another, or the wrong pencil is substituted. But the very red pencils are substitutes for other substitutes. No one gets pencils from Borrowdale anymore, but every pencil mimics one that would have come from Borrowdale. The methods of preparing pencils to mimic Borrowdale pencils give rise to another kind of pencil, these colored pencils. The mimicry becomes the thing in itself. Here, I think of supply as a term that links to abstracting or reading down, to fill in, to give a substitution for or an equivalent. What is at stake with the math reviews is just this definition of supply. Do the office supply shops supply what is asked for or substitute an equivalent? The abstracts themselves do something similar. One external reviewer may supply the need, or one editor may supply the proof. Working in teams follows the construction of supply chains as well. And this isn't just true in the MR, but I think a common factor for global knowledge work. Let's look at another international bibliographical effort that includes mathematics along with a great many other things. The US-based National Union Catalog of pre-1956 publication projects produced a truly gargantuan book of slightly more than 800 volumes. I don't know if people have seen them. They're about this tall and this wide and this thick. They're just massive, massive books. It began as Project B, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation at the Library of Congress to find all the books and manuscripts that might be useful for research or for American history. The initial form was a collection of vast card catalogs at the Library of Congress containing cards contributed from the vast Anglo-American sphere of interest in global collaboration. Over time, the War Department funded it, sales of cards funded it, and eventually it was decided to sell copies of the materials to fund the work. By the 1970s, most of the volumes had been completed, but the team had gone back to finish the volume of Bibles. The publication project meant to cover every single book ever printed prior to 1956 that would be of interest to Anglophone researchers. It includes all North American holdings, but also English, Scottish, French, Russian, Latin American, and many others to more or less degrees. What is and isn't included is actually its own very complicated question that we're not talking about today. But because of the vast resources of the Anglophone world around the two worlds, the scope of this catalog project has never been achieved in any digital or physical source. Even to this day, international online catalogs generally miss about a fifth of what the NUC 56 covers. In addition to all known mathematical books prior to 1956, this means the NUC 56 describes a lot of Bibles, like a lot of Bibles. It's for another day to talk about the way that global mathematics and scientific projects follow in the footsteps of historical global evangelical universalism. But suffice it to say that Bible is the largest and most complicated area in this series. Furthermore, the Bible was printed in nearly every human language, and all have quite similar titles. Most are meant as interchangeable commodities, bringing last year's versions up to date, so the items generally lack distinguishing characteristics. So this letter is from during the Bible part of this project, where the editors in DC send 2 blue pencils to the editors in London, who are printing the cards for the book. It asks to make sure that the 2 blue pencils are truly non-reproducing. The issue here is that the cards were marked up and photographed to produce the book. The one on the upper left is a revision card where you can see the blue pencil inventory mark. I don't know if that's the inferior or superior blue pencil. I'm not sure it really matters, but it's one or the other. The one on the right is a card that had been prepared by the Washington office and inadvertently damaged, being stamped with the inventory number in London. The pencil crossings on the bottom of the card on the right are typical. This told the camera operator in London to blank out that area of the card or to crop it off when they took a photo. So they would have taken a picture basically above this line, right? And you would just get that little slip. And their stamping machine spilled ink on it. And so they sent them back and said, which is really lucky because all the rest of these cards are gone, right? They only keep a few in the archive, really errors. A more complicated card is given as an example in the documentation for the editors. with a garland of written notes on the location of copies. The editors would have crossed out bits not to be included and made sure to edit the text to make it correct. The stamp here can be seen in the photocopy, kind of down towards the middle bottom, but was a shade of blue that didn't reproduce on the camera. And all the little letter codes are all the libraries that own this thing. You can see things they want to cancel out. Part of what the London editors did was blank out the entire frame and write up the locations on a slip of paper. They put in the frame. It's this massively complicated project of writing and rewriting. You see, in 1955, Charles Mansell had read an article in the Times of London explaining that the General Catalogue of the British Museum, begun in 1881, had only made it to the letter D and would take another 250 years to complete. The process, they had been taking catalog slips, which they had in the old catalog, and they would pull them out, and they would arrange them in alphabetical order on sheets of paper, and then they would photograph them and print them lithographically. This process apparently was taking a very long time. So Charles Mansell asked the Williamson Manufacturing Company, which is more known for airplane-based reconnaissance cameras funded by the military, to make a special camera that would quickly take pictures of these slips. They produced a prototype machine called the Williamson Abstractor. I love the word abstract here, abstractor. That looks something like the machine on the left. The machine on the left is probably the Mark IV that was never produced because the first versions were prototypes that didn't leave Mansell, but I wanted you to have something to look at. So it looks something like that. And you can see on the top, that's like the equivalent of a airplane camera aiming downwards, right? And so they would have this focal thing, and you would put something in the tray below, which you blank it out, and on the right you have a timer, so you can set how quickly it takes pictures. And so you would literally just be like, 1 second, boom, 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 and it would snap pictures. Using this abstractor, Mansell photographed up to 15 lines of an entry on a continuous roll of film. And the film would be cut into 4 columns to be printed on 1 page. This is the technology that allowed the General Catalog to be completed in 1967, 20 times faster than they had projected. The NUC thus heard about this and sought out Mansell Information, now run by John Commander, for access to this unique technology. They set weekly deadlines to ship cards across the Atlantic Ocean and began preparing their cards for photography. They experimented with this technology in 1955, around the time it was being experimented with the General Catalog, and by the 1960s were regularly sending batches. The books themselves were produced on the Mann NP56 Perfector, a lithographic press on the right, this big thing, actually that very machine, that produced huge sheets quickly. The logic of editing the material to keep machines running thus took precedent over everything else. So what we're seeing here is these have to keep going. This is fast, fast, fast. Get a whole box there. They need to print because the next volume is coming. The form that resulted was this. Many, 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 many large green volumes printed in columns of the same width, but with individual entries of varying height. Here you can see here they've cropped them. And you can see along the bottom, this is inserted by the London editorial office. They're copying around it. So they've whited out around it, they've cropped it to the bit they should, and they've printed up on the film, and then they do 3 columns to a page. Colored pencils here were like those used at mathematical reviews, but had an additional requirement that they interacted with other technology. Since the photography process was a unique prototype at this time, there was no way to specify the blue easily. It was simpler to send over some of the batch of blue pencils to see if they worked with the technology. This points to an extension of what J. Andrew Mendelssohn's discussion of the divided page in scientific observation. He noted that meteorological observations would be split into columns in the early modern period to bring together and juxtapose observations of similar and different things. This application of writing technology to adding layers of knowledge to existing writing, I think, extends to the colored page, if you will, which takes one set of writing and adds a layer of colored and distinct annotation. Unlike the divided page, the annotation can be quite sparse and go through multiple rounds. But like present-day XML and SGML, it can mark up text with other kinds of information. I think this colored page is partway to a modern conception of metadata, which separates some writing as data and other data as data about the data. This history then shows the situation of global supply as a contributing part of the development of modern information architecture and mathematics, and as a preliminary form for future computerized developments. that's what I had to show you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I'm happy for suggestions, questions, or
Thank you.
discouragement, encouragement.
Yes,
If you know any of the
let's
people I
go.
don't know.
Thank you so much for this interesting and also very entertaining talk, and let's open the discussion.
A very banal question to start with. Have you been to the Pencil Museum?
No, I want to go.
Okay.
What's it like?
I haven't been. I
Oh.
also want to go. I was going to ask how it was.
How far away? Is it near here?
I think it's in Cumbria.
It's in the Lake District, near the Lake District, yeah.
Yeah.
Bridget, what was your question? The place with the mine, with the pencils, they have like a pencil museum. I think it has the world's biggest pencil or something.
It has a very large pencil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just in the northwest.
Yeah.
What, is it called Frankfurt? No, it's
No.
called the Pencil Museum. Okay.
Okay, next question.
You said they were sending batches of cards across the ocean to be photocopied or printed, right?
Mhm.
Clearly they're copies, yes?
Mhm.
Okay.
Oh, no. Oh, the things they're sending.
Yes.
No, they sent the originals.
Did they keep copies?
So this is what's interesting. So part of it, this was a truly massive undertaking that employed hundreds of people, and now there's like one guy left who's still alive. The entire office is gone. So the only evidence of this is in the archives at the Library of Congress, and it's stuck in the subsection of the cataloging division, and no one's, other than me, ever really spent time looking at it, as far as I can tell. So that history's not been written. So I think what they did, based on the letters I've read, is they got the batch together by Friday morning and then sent a rush order to the Library of Congress microfilming division, which incidentally had been funded by Rockefeller as Project A around the same time period, which is bonkers. They would microfilm the cards, and then they would send the cards out for the Pan Am flight in the afternoon. So they actually sent the original cards. I don't know if they sent them back. I don't think they did. I think they threw them away. I think they kept the microfilm, but both the microfilm and the original cards aren't anywhere obvious. And you ask someone at the Library of Congress and they're like, oh yeah, I remember the National Union catalog. It was like 300 card catalogs in a sub-basement. It's probably still there. And I'm like, but where? And they're like, huh. So it's like, it's possible it's just like sitting there. The other thing they're doing is they're editing cards. There's a fairly elaborate editorial manual that I haven't included. It has a lot of this stuff where, because what the London editors are doing are cropping it essentially, you can't make revisions to the middle. If you make a revision to the middle, they're like, please retype it. There's a great deal of back and forth of them being like, you sent us a batch, these are no good, please retype them and send them back. And that's why the ones you saw survived, because they got sent back in a batch and they said, sorry, we spilled ink on them, can you do it again? So I'm dodging it, but they mostly sent the originals. Yeah.
I wonder if they ever lost a batch.
They certainly did. They write about losing batches, and then they retype it, and yeah. So I mean, I came across this because, in terms of the titles, that a book with this title exists, the NUC is very, very good. But in terms of where the things are, it has surprising errors, and it's because of the editorial process you saw. Because the Library of Congress just kept adding pencil annotations around it, and then someone would look at it and quickly make a strip and photocopy it. And so those are often typos and wrong. And part of why I spent time with this is I was tracing a particularly scarce, of all things, Bible. And I was like, I wonder where it is. And looked at the editorial thing, and I'm like, oh, it's just a typo. There's just this one. So it's kind of interesting that we have this like massive project that produced a limited reference resource, and we don't have the original stuff for the most part.
Thank you. I saw another question there.
Yeah, I had, wanted to ask about somebody named Neugebauer. So it came up briefly, and I guess I was thinking of a conference at NYU in 2010 that they had honoring Otto Neugebauer and so forth, and one of the speakers at that was Lou Heinzen, who wrote a piece that you maybe know. It's somewhat like this type of thing. In other words, he was talking about doing history of science as inventory.
Oh.
And essentially making the argument that Neugebauer, who's of course a massively influential expert on Babylonian mathematics, etc., etc. But Heinsohn was trying to make the point that there was some kind of fit there between the work he did, of course, Centralblatt and then math reviews and so forth, this type of activity, and his approach to the history of mathematics. Anyway, so I throw it out for what it's worth. Have you any thoughts about Neugebauer and this type of activity? And
I know less about him than I should, which is why there wasn't much about him, because I'm going to ask...
Can you show your the related question about George Sarton and his view of mathematical bibliography? Because I think that's
actually quite connected, because
Heinsohn has his biography of
because
Sarton.
because indeed Heinsohn, of course, has written about Sarton, and Sarton being kind of this father figure of the history of science in the United States.
Interesting.
And so.
Sarton's, well, I know what Michael's pointing at, which I didn't know was related. So, first of all, I'm going to come to you after it's over, and you're going to give me the citation carefully, and I'm going to write it down and read that, because it would be very useful. I know far less about him than I should, and if anyone else has Neugebauer stuff, please tell me. Don't think I know it. Sarton, in his two lectures that he gave on history of science and history of mathematics that were kind of the field-defining ones that got reprinted everywhere, towards the end of the history of mathematics, gets really mad about mathematical bibliography. He's like, it's really important, but don't get distracted. It's perverse. He literally calls it perverse, and it's weird, and people do it too much. And I was reading it, and I was like, what happened? Like, did like a bibliography eat his dog? Like, what's going on? And Michael knows I was tracing this, because I'm like, Sarton surely likes bibliography, because if you read his books, it's like one thing after another. So like, is he talking about something else here than what I mean? Is this just a fit of something? One of the things we've been kicking around or wondering is if like he was mad about what Neugebauer was doing or his students were distracted.
I should just add as a comment, so in print, Neugebauer really made clear what he thought of Sarton, and he despised him.
Okay.
so this may
be the connection, actually.
I mean, he had a very, very low opinion of the approach to the history of science that he claimed Sarton stood for.
You might have solved the problem for you. This is a good hypothesis. This is why, because Sarton's very mad about, and I was like, because he's just, it's the language of it is like what you would expect from a founder's talk about the founding of a discipline. He's like, oh, it's this, but then he's just mad about bibliography for.
I mean, and it's a divide that's huge actually in the beginning of the community, because you have the people. Sarton is a generalist, called by Neugebauer a dilettante. He's someone who doesn't really know what he's writing about and so forth. So it's a massively, I mean, when I studied history of science long ago, people were still talking about this stuff.
Was this a later volume? Reinhard Sigmund Schulze made this argument basically that there is a connection between Neugebauer's bibliography and his antiquarianism, but it's not a needed connection as we would like it to be historiographically to tell a neat story. We did this because there's this line he quotes from Neugebauer: "He's not in possession of any Weltanschauung."
Right.
Which becomes the title of Sigmund Schulze's Reinhard's article.
Yeah, he claimed not to be in.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you very much. I saw another question.
Yeah, just a comment, not directly about Neugebauer, but the sort of previous generation. In Lambert's book, there's a really interesting chapter about practices of mathematical bibliography arising out of a sort of natural history.
Oh, I love it. I should have cited it.
So take a look at that.
I will. Thank you. Deborah and I have been talking about Lambert's book, and you're ahead of me in reading it, because I was going to read it, and we're going to talk about it. Thank you.
Am I overlooking someone?
I was wondering if you had, and this is kind of needle in a haystack stuff, but mathematicians using this catalog to find papers, obviously that would just be the luckiest thing in the world to find someone mentioning it. But have you looked at all at how it was used once it was made to kind of
In UC 56?
Yeah, because you said it was they wanted to include things that would be useful for research, and so then how was it used?
So amazingly, there's a file in the catalog division of people from the AMS writing to the NUC project going, we really appreciate you putting the books about math in, but what about the articles? And also, could we have pictures of all the covers of journals? Because we really need to know what dates journals came out. And they basically were like, it's like going too fast. So there's something interesting here too with the specificity of what you need for doing mathematical bibliography, where the logic of the NUC after, basically I think from the moment they started, was one of production. The scale of the work was too absurd for them to slow down or change anything ever. Every decision was like, we have to fill a box by Friday. And that was similar to where the mathematicians were like, could you do it differently? And they're like, too late, we're never gonna finish it. And so there's an interesting gap there because the NUC doesn't include articles, really, unless it like accidentally showed up as a book-like thing somewhere, kind of in the way that WorldCat doesn't include articles unless it does. And so it's not actually well suited for what Math Reviews or Zentralblatt does, which is to identify all the work by a particular mathematician. It does something slightly different. So I have seen them, but no one seemed mad. They just were kind of like, why don't you do this? And they're like, too busy filling out cards, leave us alone. Like, keep working, talk to the Math Reviews. I don't know if that answers it.
Yeah, thank you.
There's another dimension to that question, right, which is about the technological crossover and the organizational crossover, the sort of this clerical structures aspect of your title that has more of the direct connection, right, between the catalog and the mathematicians.
Well, because I mean, it's the same thing. The thing I'm trying to think about is these clerical structures for organizing knowledge throughout the 20th century seem to have something that I don't know the name of, but is like a common root. There's like the clerical practice, there's the office practice. It's whatever Ray Goucher was, who we barely know anything about, and why he knew to like really be very fussy about red pencils, like incredibly fussy about, I mean, that's what started this. I was like, why is he so worried? Can't he just use a different red pencil or something? And so there is something there where I think they learn from each other. And I think there's both explicit and tacit learning, because as people, the way you'd interact with the National Union catalog, full thing is by letter. And so prior to the existence of the volumes, and even after the existence of the volumes, while it still existed, you would write a letter, say, Dear Library of Congress, could you give me a list of everything you have in your catalog, which is attributed to Otto Neugebauer? And they would go, we'll be back with you in a month. And then they would write up everything they have. And they would have this just massive shaggy card catalog that has all sorts of inclusions that was much bigger and better than this more narrow catalog, but was like totally anarchic and unpredictable. And so there's something interesting here too, where on the grounds, I think, of analyzing clerical process, you can see what the result is capable of doing and not doing, but that's not like a designed part of it. Like the NUC 56 had no beef with mathematicians, but it doesn't serve what a working mathematician, for the most part, would want, only partially. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's the deeper.
Thank you. I also have a question about the colors. So you mentioned that it's not entirely clear yet why these colors were used by these people, like red, blue, green, and so on.
Yeah, I don't know.
And I wonder whether you have tried to compare this with other institutions. So my first thoughts went into politics, like ministries, but also other institutions like civil service, where I also know about traditions of using particular colors that would be rollerball pens rather than pencils. But there seems to be something there with hierarchy and with habits, what colors people use.
Interesting.
Who uses what? And I wonder whether I've tried to compare this with something else.
I've been trying to find it, but I haven't. When is the thing you're thinking of and where? Do you remember?
Oh, it would be relatively modern, and
Okay.
it would be in Germany.
Okay.
But still, maybe it's just worth looking at political institutions or something that is close to politics and look at hierarchy and whether you find some place where particular colors would be used by particular people in the hierarchy. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I'd like to find that. I mean, this is the modern accounting and auditing practice, that red is the person who's working on the account, blue is their supervisor, and green is a partner, right? And so you have very few green corrections and all of them stand, and red is like, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm guessing it's a 19th century thing, because as you see the same thing, a part of this that isn't here is about lithographic transfer ink in the writing of government documents, and mathematicians use this to produce their typographically difficult work. And this is a technology that really exploded in France in the 1820s for government offices. And so that actually might be a good place to look. The earliest, because I keep pushing colored pencils back, the earliest I seem to find them is like mid-19th century. So I mean, maybe that's the thing, is look at government offices in the mid-19th century.
Maybe, and then who knows what came first and who was influenced by what?
Yeah.
I certainly don't know. I immediately had this connection in my mind.
Well, no, but this points to something that is like what I'm trying to, that's harder to explain, like the historiographical method here, is this comes out of 17th century work where I'm looking at the clerks working at the Royal Society. And the clerks working at the Royal Society often learn their business from Parliament. Why not? It's just down the block, and right? Yeah. You hire a secretary from Parliament, William Williamson secretary, and go, you're not working with foreign affairs, you're working with letters from mathematicians now. Great. And so there's an exchange of clerks.
Of traditions.
Yep, and so there's like a world of clerking apprenticeships in the 17th century, which helps you understand the activities of an office you don't know.
Yes.
And then I have a vast gap of specific knowledge in the 19th and 20th century that I'm trying to bridge, because, or in the 18th for that matter, is where does a clerk learn their business? And you get a clerk from a ministry office and then employ them in your business, or do they get, in the 20th century, they learn it from schools, right? Schools for secretaries and whatnot. And so there's a kind of middle zone that I don't...
That's interesting.
Yeah. And I think there's a history there, right? So I think the history of clerking in like the long 18th and 19th century is like an apprenticeship-based thing that if we explained would shed historical light on the formation of a number of modern social institutions. But it's a huge gap. I'm just excited about it. I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
I have a question for all of us, I think, because coming from the classification project, there is something that Daniel Gorenstein did in the mid-70s. He produced an excerpt of the math reviews classifying, only putting papers related to finite simple group theory in there. It was a very thick thing. And Alcuin said, well, took him 2 months or so. I don't know how he did it. He must have had some help. But is this something very special, or did other sub-disciplines do something similar? I mean, it's a real, it's an 800-page thing, and it's very, very interesting.
This is something we're paying attention to. Do you want to get the answer?
Well, I have one fact. I can't answer the intellectual question, but I'll contribute a fact. So part of this work comes from, I did an archival appraisal of the material at the math reviews that they don't need anymore. So like 1940 to like 1980 or so. And they have several of these math reviews published book series around topics where they're like, they weren't, I talked to the current editor about it and it wasn't a high priority. But my sense was that they like didn't take off, that it was someone's clever idea for making a little money, where they're like, oh, for engineers, we'll sell it again. Oh, these ones will be good.
A big name and a good topic.
But they didn't stick. And so they actually have a box of, as part of their archive, like one of all the ones they tried, which is like 2 boxes worth.
Ah, that's interesting.
Our main source, apart from this appraisal of information about these, is obviously if you go to MathSciNet, you don't have access to this information. But if you, for instance, obtain an entire run of mathematical reviews that was being deaccessioned by the College of the Pacific and ship it to Scotland, you get to see the end papers from the volumes. And on the end papers, they have advertisements for these supplementary volumes.
But this ties to the broader, like, and then I'll stop, I want to hear the group's answer, but it's like the question of clerical history, right? So if I'm a clerk working in an office and I don't know anything about the content, like a basic move is like, let's carve off a section and sell it again, right? We're selling the full thing, let's, right? And this is repeated. You actually see this with secretaries in the 17th century carving out sections. And so I want to gloss it for the group is like, where's the boundary for intrinsic questions about mathematics and extrinsic questions about making money running an office, right? Like, how do we even figure out where the boundary is?
Okay, some more questions, yes?
I hesitate to bring this up because it may be rather independent, but the use of color goes back a long way in mathematics. I mean, the Moscow Papyrus, for crying out loud, is in red and black. And more modern expressions of mathematics that use color in a fundamental way, like Burns Euclid, or what was huge in the late 1980s in American textbooks was to introduce 4-color printing, because they had cheap ways of doing that now. And that becomes a pedagogical gimmick, right? All of this goes back to just the way humans work with color and information, right? I don't know where that sits in your.
I mean, I think this is the piece where I got excited about the question of local versus global technologies. So what I think that what you're outlining, the broad thing, has to do with the history of pigment, right? So it wasn't really until the 20th century that most people could get things in basically whatever color they wanted. You were limited to the pigments in your local market or that someone imported, right? And what as part of this, it's not here because I don't have an answer for it. It's just looking at the history of pigments, because you can, like the pencils, right? They're moving different kinds of quite rare substances from this mine to this place and putting it in clay and selling it in America. There's an international dictionary of pigments, which means to cover everything that ever existed. So of course it doesn't, but how many does it have? Just tens of thousands, which is both like really big, but also surprisingly small to me. They're like all the colors I've ever seen, you know, assuming they're only half of them, it's still tens of thousands of different pigments, which kind of makes sense. And so I think the thing you're seeing with 1980s textbooks in color lithography is that we got really good at color lithography sometimes in the 60s and 70s, and the global supply chains for colored ink really stabilized. And so there's a sort of solution looking for a problem going on. And I think the same may prevail. I'm no expert on ancient mathematics, and I wouldn't pretend it, but I think the same may prevail on the use of color in old text, which is like what is locally available, because it's it's very weird in terms of human history that we could like walk down to Ryman's and buy a pencil in basically any color I want, which I could more or less write with. I don't know if anyone took me up on the Conte chalk experiment. They don't write well, and it smears. And that's what they would have been dealing with prior to about this 1840-ish moment before they figured out how to make it like a pencil. And so there's something interesting that changes here too, that, you know, if you're a scribe and you're working in a context and you have red rubrication ink and you have a rubricator and you're making it and you know how to do it, you can use it. But when you look at a, you know, globalized 19th century world of letters, does that make sense? So I think it's pigment, right? Like pigment as a global commodity, and like it's its own, it's still a problem. Like some pigments are really hard to get.
Thank you for this really interesting discussion. Thanks to all of you, but also thanks again to the speaker.